Welcome to Exploring Swift, the next step in your Swift journey. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name's Jonathan Crook. I've been a professional Swift and Objective-C developer since 2010. During that time, I've mostly been developing for iOS-based devices, the iPhone, iPad, and watchOS. Before I began developing professionally, I worked in education. I hope that I can bring this experience to help teaching you Swift. Now that you know the basics of Swift and some of its most attractive features, the focus of Exploring Swift will be to broaden out to the ecosystem surrounding the core of the Swift language itself. We'll start by properly exploring and understanding the role of the Swift standard library. We'll also start to teach an understanding of how the standard library and the core Swift language actually work. This will really level up your skills. In tandem with this, we'll start working properly with Apple's Foundation framework. This high-level framework contains many of the tools you'll need to tackle common modern application tasks, such as file management, serializing and deserializing data, working with common data types such as dates and URLs, and performing networking requests. By the end of this section, you'll be able to write command line tools that access and process data from disk or from the network. We'll mostly be working in Xcode playgrounds throughout this course. However, towards the end we'll start using Xcode properly, creating your first full projects, and exploring Xcode's debugger. In order to study this course, you should have familiarity with at least one reasonably modern object-oriented programming language, such as C++, Python, C#, Objective-C, or Java. We won't be teaching any fundamental programming concepts, so knowledge here is assumed. You should also have a basic understanding of most of Swift's core features. This means you should have either read through most of Apple's Swift programming guide. Content in Exploring Swift will take you deeper into these concepts and teach you real working Swift for modern application development. In order to program in Swift, you need access to an Ubuntu system or preferably a modern macOS system. Most of the content in this course is cross-platform compatible. However, you'll find that using Xcode is now more and more necessary, since it's the most fully featured development environment available for Swift. Let's emphasize the three layers of Swift you'll learn to understand in Exploring Swift. At the bottom is the core of the Swift language. At its heart, this is the Swift compiler implemented in C++. It's also the smallest piece. You'll discover during this course how much of Swift functionality is actually implemented using the Swift language itself. The next and much more interesting layer is the Swift standard library. In fact, you've probably already been using it. In this course, we'll learn to appreciate how it's implemented and how it really works. You'll gain a lot of understanding of Swift by studying the standard library. The final piece is Apple's Foundation framework. Apple have open sourced Foundation and rewritten much of it in Swift. Foundation itself is a very large topic and there's a lot to learn, more than we can cover in a course. Instead, we'll be focusing on giving you enough knowledge to start working with Foundation and some of its essential highlights. Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference was held in June 2017, and the first beta versions of the next version of the Xcode developer tools are already available in beta form. Please check the current status at Apple's developer website at developer.apple.com. It's possible that by the time you study this course, the final version of Xcode 9 will be available, in which case you can download it from the Mac App Store as usual. Xcode 9 also includes Swift 4. Whilst this new version is not as radical a change as version 3, there are some changes and new features. We'll start working with Swift 4 already to make sure you're up to date for its release later in 2017. If you're working on Ubuntu, you'll find versions of Swift 4 that you can download from the swift.org website using the link swift.org/download. Before we begin exploring Swift, let's show a few tips about accessing the Swift standard library, both locally as part of an Xcode installation and using Apple's online resources. There are three methods you can use to access the standard library. The first is via Xcode's documentation feature. This is generally the first place you should look when investigating new APIs. The documentation browser is very friendly and makes use of hyperlinks between content. The second place you can look is by accessing the public definitions of standard library types through Xcode's source editor. For the time being, we've been using Playgrounds, but the same will apply when you start working on projects. This is the place to go to quickly check details of a type's interface. As you become more proficient with Swift, you'll find yourself using this method more and more often. Finally, the third place you can look is it the implementation source code of the standard library itself on GitHub. It's unlikely you'll want to use this frequently at this stage. At this stage you're a consumer of public APIs, and the implementation details should not be considered. However, by browsing this repository, you can learn a lot about top-level Swift from Apple's Swift team and open source contributors. Now let's look at the same information sources for Foundation. We briefly used the import statement at the end of my last course, Swift Mastering the Core Concepts. This is your entry point to actually using Foundation types and functions in your code. The import statement makes a framework available. Once the framework is imported, you can use the same jump to definition method to access the public definitions of Foundation. As before, however, the primary source of information should usually be Xcode documentation. Finally, the open source cross-platform implementation of Foundation is available on GitHub. Here you can find the framework's actual source code.